JP, thank goodness you're okay.
Any reason I wouldn't be? Say, did I tell you I got someone from the Firebase team that offered to chat with us about data best practices?
No, but actually I think that might be just the kind of guidance that we need. It's incredibly important that we get this stuff right. Crap, though. I've got a bocce ball game with the investors. Do you think that you could take notes?
Or better yet, the developer could come over to Google.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. Want to borrow the company Appaloosa?
Hello and welcome. I'm here with Abe again, and I'm joined by Puff. Puff is also an engineer on the Firebase team. Welcome, Puff.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I'm trying to advise a friend on how to correctly come up with a database schema for Firebase, and I imagine there could be some pitfalls. Is there an issue in getting your schema right up front?
Now, one of the things Firebase really allows you to be flexible about how you structure your data. And that's one of the great benefits of using a schemaless NoSQL database. Unfortunately, it's also one of the pitfalls because people tend to not think up front of how they need to model their data. And that's one of the things where at some point during the lifecycle of your application, you need to start then hammering down the structure. You need to start validating your data. If you don't, you're going to run into issues later with either scalability or, especially when you're an Android developer, you need to start mapping your schemaless JSON into your Java classes. And that becomes progressively more expensive if you make changes later on in the cycle.
An important thing to note about Firebase is that when you start out, when you get a new Firebase, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can write in any type of crazy structure you want to when you're developing and when you're testing. And this is easier on web than it is on Android, where your structure can be very, very loose. But once you get something and you're like, this is what we're going with, this is how we're building, you can lock that structure in. You can write schema validations, and you can make sure that the only data in your Firebase matches these rules. Yes. So initially it's very freeform, but once you have it more concrete about what you're building and how you want to build it, you can lock it in just like you would in any other database.
So when you're developing apps and you're first laying out your schema, how do you go about doing it? Do you sketch it on paper? Do you take some JSON data and sort of model it? How do you go about actually doing it?
I usually start with just some code where I write some of the sample data. Is that the same as you do?
Yeah, I think for sure if you get a little bit of code where you start saying like, all right, here is a very loosely defined user creation page where I can start writing what a user object looks like, I start figuring out what I need, and then that data can start showing up in your Firebase right away because it's so easy to get up and running with, that then you can be like, all right, I need this profile information, or I need a list of their likes or whatever. And you can just start very free-forming building out your data structure. And then once you're confident with your structure, like I said, you can lock it in. But up until then, you can just very casually add in things where you need to and experiment with the structure. For most cases, I find that works. Sometimes if it's a very large app and you know there's going to be tons of different types of data in there, I'll whiteboard it out and sketch out like, all right, here's this, and this will have a list that points to this other type of data or something like that. But it's much more common that I just start playing around and then develop the structure that way.
Yeah, and because what you then notice is that after you figure out your structure and how you want to store the data, or what data you want to store mostly, then you start worrying about scalability of the data. And that's something you can then do later. So you now know which data you want. Now let's think about how we can make this scalable. But starting with some exploratory coding and just structuring the data as you go along is very common.
Great. So, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see new developers doing when they are designing their schema?
I think people, because Firebase can have this very complicated nested structure where you can essentially mimic any JSON structure you have, which could be, users, and then under users, a list of user names, and under that, each user could have a list of their friends, which could have a whole bunch of profile information about them that could have their profile. You end up with this very nested structure, and that doesn't work very well in Firebase. It's very hard to be specific about what you're loading if you have this very complicated, deep structure. So that nesting, I think, is a very common issue. It's not that it doesn't work, it's just that it doesn't scale as well.
No, and it's very natural. You see that lots of developers, right? Most of us come from a SQL background where we work with relational databases. And there you cannot do hierarchies very easily. So when you get to a hierarchical database like Firebase, it's very natural to want to start building these nested structures because you've never been able to do them. And that's when, as Abe said, we need to start paying attention to not overly nesting the data because you're going to run into issues later on. So you typically want to stay relatively flat in your data structure, and that's not very appealing to developers coming from a SQL background.
Okay, do you guys have any good like war stories? Some like where you gave assistance to customers that had some hiccups because they didn't follow best practices?
Yeah, you don't get to 250,000 developers without some war stories. So, no, what we see quite often is that people start gathering lots of data in long lists. And that is fine if you need all that data, but one of the ones we saw was we had a developer that was tracking couriers who were delivering packages across the city, and each courier was, I imagined them being on their moped, and their phone was pinging the Firebase server. So there's lots of data being generated, and they were keeping this data in one long list that would last essentially for like days on end. And yeah, that would be 500,000 items easily. And they were showing this in a dashboard, and things were sluggish in general. It was not the performance they were looking for. So it's like, well, okay, how many items do you want to show in this list? And it turns out they were actually showing like at most the last 5 minutes of data. And this is one of the things that you have to then start explaining to them. Well, if you only want to show 5 minutes of data, then why are you keeping days of data in one big list? Because you will have to query all of it to just get the top 10 items. So that's a very common one we see, where people are not separating their active data from their historical data, and yeah, these hurt. So we see this quite often. Do you have some good ones?
Yeah, another common issue related to that is people will go and they'll build some application with Firebase really quickly because it lets you do that, and they'll start getting a ton of data, and then they'll make one mistake in their code and they will clear out their Firebase. This is not normally possible if you're adhering to what our best practices that we provide in our documentation, which is basically that you restrict things in your Firebase. You say only this type of data can exist here, only these people can write to this and that. That way when you're developing, you don't accidentally delete all your Firebase data. But because we don't enforce that, because in the we want you to be able to experiment and play around, we don't know if you're trying to clear out your Firebase because you're tired of the structure you made, or if you made a mistake in your code and some bug is clearing it out. So we see that a lot, especially at like things like hackathons, where people are trying to write code very quickly, and they're like, oh, I'll not bother with the security rules, I won't bother enforcing a schema, and then they make one mistake, and they're like, where's all my data? And the answer is it's gone. Luckily, we have backups for that. We do backups of your Firebases all the time, and we can recover that if it's like important mission critical data. But in general, it's a very easy mistake to make if you're not following our best practices and implementing security and validation rules.
Good one. Yeah, last one I remember is I was talking to a game developer, and they were doing a iOS app, I think, where you got to vote on either the blue egg hatched or the red egg would hatch. And they were looking for, okay, so we would probably use transactions to keep the count, right, of who voted for what. And this is a common one where it's like, well, how many players do you get in, and how often do they, or how fast is the vote? And it's like they had 500,000 in like 30 seconds. And that's typically something where if you start doing transactions, yeah, it will not scale very well anymore because everyone will be hitting that same counter at that time. So there you see that no, you need to steer into a direction where you actually, instead of increasing a counter, you keep the votes and start counting them separately. And this is always fun to explain because yeah, people are used to doing transactions.
Well, guys, really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. I'm sure that our developer will really be able to take this advice and continue on developing their app.
Cool, okay.
Glad we could help.
Yeah, thanks.